The morning Cecil Hawkins rode into the valley with an eviction notice folded in the breast pocket of his coat. The sky above the Arizona territory was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and gold in threatening rain, and he had told himself at least a dozen times before he even reached the bottom of the ridge that this was just a job, that he was just a man doing what he had been paid to do, and that whatever he found at the end of that long dirt road would not change the facts written in black ink on that folded piece of paper. He had been wrong about many things in his 31 years of living. He had been wrong about the war, which he had believed would be over in months, and had stretched into years that carved scars into the bodies and souls of men he had known since boyhood. He had been wrong about his father's mine, which had promised silver and delivered only debt. He had been wrong about the road from Tucson to the Ramsey homestead, which he had been told was easy riding, and turned out to be rutted and mean, and had nearly thrown his horse twice before noon. But none of those miscalculations had prepared him for Theodora Ramsey. He had the facts before him. He had read the file that Everett Crane had pressed into his hands across the wide mahogany desk in his Tucson office, had read it twice on the ride out, and once more by firelight the night he camped near the dry creek bed. The homestead had belonged to the Ramsey family since 1871, when Samuel Ramsey had filed his claim under the Homestead Act and built the first structure on the property with his own 2 hands and the help of a half-dozen men from the nearest town. Samuel Ramsey had died in the winter of 1876, leaving behind a wife who had followed him to the grave before the next spring thaw, and a daughter named Theodora who had been 19 years old at the time and had, according to Everett Crane's records and the opinion of every man in that corner of the territory who thought it, was his business to have an opinion about such things. No business trying to run the place alone. That had been 3 years ago. It was now the summer of 1879, and Theodora Ramsey was 22 years old, and according to the bank in Tucson that held the deed to the property, she owed 14 months of back taxes plus the interest that had accumulated since the first payment was missed. And Everett Crane, who was the bank's man in the territory, and also the county land agent, and also the owner of 3 other properties in the valley that he had acquired through means that Cecil privately considered questionable, had decided that the time for waiting was over. Cecil was not Crane's man, not exactly. He was a lawyer, or he had trained as one, having read law for 2 years in a firm in St. Louis before the war had disrupted everything, and he had come west afterward, because there was nothing left for him in Missouri, and the West was where a man could start again. Or so the stories went. He had set up a small practice in Tucson doing wills and land transfers and the occasional contract dispute, and when Crane had come to him and said he needed a man with legal training to deliver the notice and make sure it was done properly, Cecil had taken the work because his rent was due, and the work had been thin that spring. He told himself all of this again as he rode the last quarter-mile toward the homestead, watching the structure take shape through the shimmer of morning heat. It was a solid house, more solid than he had expected. 2 stories, which was unusual for a homestead out here, with a porch that ran along the front and wrapped around the south side. The wood had been weathered, but it had been kept, and there were window boxes filled with something that was either struggling flowers or thriving weeds, and at that distance he could not tell which. There was a barn in good repair behind and to the left, and beyond it what looked like a kitchen garden that was clearly being worked, the rows visible and orderly even from this distance. A line of washing hung between 2 posts near the north side of the house, pale shapes lifting and dropping in the morning wind. Whatever he had expected of a young woman alone on a homestead, barely keeping ahead of debt for 3 years, it had not been this. It had not been a place that looked like someone had taken pride in it, had fought for it, had refused to let it die. He pulled his horse to a stop at the fence gate and dismounted, looping the reins around the post. He straightened his coat, adjusted his hat, and patted his breast pocket where the notice waited, folded into its neat rectangle of consequence. He had practiced what he was going to say. He had the speech ready, polished, reasonable and firm in equal measure, the kind of tone that communicated unavoidable necessity without cruelty. He had even rehearsed the part where she would cry or argue or both, and the calm, measured responses he had prepared for each possibility. He opened the gate and walked up the path toward the front door. He had made it exactly 4 steps when the front door opened and Theodora Ramsey appeared on the porch, and every word of every sentence he had ever prepared dissolved from his mind like morning frost under a rising sun. She was not what the file had suggested. The file had suggested a struggling woman, a woman in trouble, a woman who was behind on her obligations and probably reaching the end of her resources and her resolve. The file had not mentioned that she was tall and straight-backed with dark auburn hair that was pinned up in a practical bun, but with pieces coming loose around her face from what looked like already having been at work for hours, despite the early hour. The file had not mentioned that she had brown eyes the warm color of good coffee, and a face that was weathered just enough by 3 years of hard living to look honest rather than worn. The file had not mentioned that she was wearing a dark work apron over a brown dress and that she had flour on her left forearm, and what appeared to be a smear of engine grease on her right wrist, which suggested she had been doing at least 2 very different things before 6 in the morning, and had managed both of them with evident competence. She looked at him without alarm, which surprised him. Most people who saw a stranger riding up to their property in the morning showed at least a flicker of wariness. She just looked at him with those steady brown eyes, measuring, and then she said, "You are either lost or you are from Tucson. You do not look like a man who gets lost." Cecil opened his mouth. He closed it. He had no words. This had never happened to him before. He was a lawyer. Words were the entire substance of his profession. "Come up on the porch," she said, without waiting for his answer. "I have coffee on. It is too warm already, but it is still better than standing in the sun." And somehow, before his brain had fully reconnected to his body, his feet had carried him up the 3 steps to the porch, and he was standing on the worn boards, and she had disappeared back inside the house and returned in what felt like an instant with 2 tin cups of coffee, one of which she held out to him with the casual certainty of a woman who had decided he was going to take it whether he wanted it or not. He took it. He wrapped both hands around the warm metal of the cup, and he looked down at the dark surface of the coffee, and he thought, very clearly, that he could not remember a single word of what he had planned to say. "You are Cecil Hawkins," she said. It was not a question. She settled herself into the wooden chair at the far end of the porch and looked at him with the same calm, measuring attention. "Everett Crane said he was sending someone. He said it would be someone with a piece of paper." The words broke through whatever had seized hold of his brain. He reached for the professional distance he had cultivated over years of delivering bad news. "Miss Ramsey," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, "I am Cecil Hawkins. I am an attorney retained by the Southwestern Territorial Bank through Mr. Everett Crane, and I have been sent in the capacity of the county land agent's representative to tell me they are taking my land," she said, and her voice was perfectly even. Not cold, not broken. Even. He stopped. He looked at her. She was looking at the middle distance beyond the porch railing, somewhere toward the barn, and she had both hands wrapped around her own cup of coffee in exactly the same way he was holding his. "Yes," he said, because the speech he had prepared seemed obscene in the face of that quietness. "That is what the notice says." She nodded once slowly, and then she looked back at him, and he saw that she had already known. She had been waiting for this. The knowledge of it had been sitting in the corner of her life for months, probably, and she had looked it in the face and made her peace with it, and she was still here, still standing, still handing coffee to the man who had come to take everything from her. He did not hand her the notice. He could not make his hand move to his breast pocket. "Sit down, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "I am not going to make this easy for Everett Crane, but I am not going to make it hard for you either. You did not create this debt. You just got paid to carry it." He sat, though he could not have said exactly when he decided to. He sat in the other chair on the porch and he drank her coffee and he looked out at the valley and tried to remember that he was here to do a job. "How long?" she asked. "You have 30 days from the date the notice is formally served," he said. She nodded again. "And when does it formally begin?" "When I hand you the paper," he said. She looked at him then, and something shifted in her expression, something brief and complicated that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, and was possibly both at once. "Then I suppose we have a little time yet," she said. Cecil Hawkins, who had never in his professional life failed to deliver a document he had been retained to deliver, sat on Theodora Ramsey's porch and drank her coffee and did not hand her the notice. He told himself it was only because he was still gathering his thoughts. He told himself it was professional thoroughness, that he should understand the full situation before serving the papers. He told himself a great many things, most of which he did not believe. The coffee was very good. Strong and dark, and just slightly sweet in a way that suggested she had added a small amount of something. Molasses, perhaps, which was a particular method he had not encountered before but which suited the morning perfectly. He noted this, and then he noted that he was sitting here thinking about how she made her coffee rather than doing the thing he had come to do, and he cleared his throat. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "I should explain the full. My father built this house in 1871, she said, not interrupting precisely, but beginning to speak at the same moment he did, so that their words overlapped for a moment before she continued. "He worked a piece of land in Tennessee before the war and lost it after. He came west because he believed that a man who was willing to work hard enough could hold on to something out here. He believed that the land would reward the labor." Cecil was quiet. He let her talk, because it was clearly necessary that she say this, that she had been holding it and needed to put it somewhere, and because the least he could do for the woman he was about to evict was listen to her. "He was right about the land rewarding labor," she said. "He was wrong about whether the bank would let you keep what you earned. My parents worked themselves into their graves for this place. Not because they were careless or incompetent, because 2 bad winters in a row will break a man who does not have enough in reserve, and nobody gives you reserve when you are starting from nothing." She paused. "I have kept this place for 3 years since they died. I have kept it well. The garden feeds me and provides a surplus I sell in town. The barn is full. I have 12 horses, 2 breeding mares, a bull, and a herd of 14 cattle. I am not some helpless girl who did not understand what she was doing." "I can see that," Cecil said, and he meant it. She looked at him with those brown eyes. "But I owe the money," she said. "I know I owe the money. I am not pretending otherwise. 2 years of taxes and the interest, I know the number. What I want to know is whether there is any legal mechanism by which I could challenge the timeline or negotiate a payment structure, because I have been trying to discuss this with the bank directly for 6 months, and every time I go into Tucson they find a reason to send me home." Something sharpened in Cecil's attention. He set down his coffee cup. "What do you mean, they find a reason to send you home?" "I mean," she said, with careful precision, "that I have been to the Southwestern Territorial Bank 4 times in the past 6 months with a proposal for a payment plan. I have the figures written down. I know what I can pay each quarter. I presented this to the clerk on the first visit. He told me Mr. Crane was not available. On the second visit, he told me Mr. Crane was in a meeting. On the third visit, he told me that the matter was being handled and I should wait to hear from them. On the fourth visit, I was told that the decision had been made and I should expect a formal communication." Cecil was very still. "Did you get any of this in writing?" "I did not," she said. "They never gave me anything in writing." He picked up his coffee cup again, not because he wanted coffee, but because he needed something to do with his hands while he thought. This was a different problem than what he had understood himself to be walking into. He had thought he was here to serve papers on a woman who had failed to manage her finances. He was beginning to wonder whether he was here to serve papers on a woman who had been deliberately shut out of every attempt she made to address the problem legitimately. Everett Crane owned 3 other properties in the valley. That was the fact that lived in the back of his mind now, quiet and significant as a coal in a fire. "Miss Ramsey," he said slowly, "I need to ask you something that is somewhat outside the scope of what I was retained to do." She looked at him steadily. "Ask." "Is Everett Crane aware of what your land is worth? Not what you owe. What the land itself, with the improvements and the water rights, would be worth to a buyer." The look she gave him then was not surprise. It was recognition. "My father filed for water rights in 1871 when he dug the well and found the spring. That filing covers the underground spring and the creek that runs along the east boundary. The spring runs year-round. There is very little year-round water in this part of the territory." She paused. "Mr. Crane's other 3 properties are all on the eastern side of the ridge. They are dry land without the water rights." The silence that followed was the kind that contained a great deal of meaning. "I see," Cecil said. "Do you?" she said, and for the first time there was something in her voice that was not calm, a tight, barely controlled edge that he recognized as the sound of 3 years of careful composure beginning to fracture just slightly at the seams. "I think," Cecil said, and he was choosing each word with the deliberateness of a man building something, "that I would like to review the original deed and the water rights filing if you have them." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I am a lawyer," he said, "and if there is a legal argument to be made here, I would like to know what it is before I serve those papers." Another silence. The wind moved through the washing on the line. Somewhere in the barn, a horse made a sound of contentment that carried clearly in the morning quiet. "You came here to evict me," she said. "I came here to serve a notice," he said. "There is a 30-day period before anything becomes final. Nothing about my doing my job correctly prevents me from also doing it thoroughly." She studied him. He had the clear impression of being evaluated in a way that was entirely serious and not at all self-conscious about its seriousness. She was not coy. She was not performatively vulnerable. She was a woman who had been running this place alone for 3 years, and she knew the difference between someone who meant what they said and someone who did not, and she was deciding which category he fell into. "Come inside," she said finally. "I will show you the papers." The interior of the house was as composed as the exterior. It was not fancy, but it was deliberate. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large iron stove against the north wall, and a rough-hewn table in the center that had been scrubbed so many times the wood had gone pale. There were shelves of preserves along one wall, jars of deep red and gold and dark purple that represented the labor of seasons past. There was a braided rag rug on the floor that had been carefully made and showed the wear of heavy use. Above the mantel of the stone fireplace there was a framed piece of needlework that read in plain lettering, "This ground was won and it will not be surrendered," and beneath it in smaller letters, "S. Ramsey, 1871. Cecil stood in the middle of the room and felt something he could not immediately name. It was something in the region of his chest. He stood there looking at that piece of needlework while Theodora went to the wooden chest under the stairs and opened it and sorted through the papers inside with the practiced efficiency of someone who had looked at these papers many times. "Here," she said, and spread several documents on the table. "The original deed, the water rights filing, the homestead claim receipt, and this," she set down a separate envelope, "is every record I have of my attempts to communicate with the bank." He crossed to the table and looked at the documents. He bent over them, and she stood on the other side of the table and watched him read, and neither of them said anything for several minutes. The water rights filing was clear. Samuel Ramsey had filed properly in 1871, and the rights had been recorded and were indisputably attached to the property. The deed was also clear. What was less clear, what Cecil found himself reading 3 times, was the original loan document that had been used to file the claim, because buried in the language of the repayment terms was a clause about the procedure required for the bank to exercise foreclosure, and that procedure included a written notice to the debtor, no less than 90 days prior to any legal action, delivered by certified post or in person with a signed receipt. He straightened up and looked at Theodora. "When did you receive the first written communication from the bank about this?" he asked. "That letter," she said, and pointed to a single sheet in the envelope. 6 weeks ago." He picked it up and read it. It was not the 90-day notice required by the contract. It was a general notification of arrears. It was not, by any stretch of legal interpretation, a proper foreclosure notice under the terms of the original loan. "Did you receive a formal notice of foreclosure proceedings?" he asked. "A specific document? Not until 3 days ago," she said. "A rider came from town with a paper from the bank saying that Mr. Crane had initiated proceedings and that someone would be coming to serve formal notice." Cecil set the letter down very carefully on the table. He looked at the papers spread before him. He looked at the needlework above the fireplace. He looked at Theodora Ramsey, who was standing straight-backed on the other side of the table watching him with those steady brown eyes that did not ask for anything, that simply waited. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "the foreclosure proceedings as they have been conducted are not in compliance with the terms of the original loan agreement. You were entitled to 90 days written notice before proceedings could begin. The notification you received 6 weeks ago does not constitute proper notice. The notice I am here to serve today is premature." She did not move. She did not change expression. But something happened in her eyes, a shift like the moment when a lamp is lit and the room goes from dark to lit, and he understood that she had not known there was any hope left, and this was the first crack of light she had seen in a very long time. "What does that mean?" she said, and her voice was very controlled. "It means," he said, "that if I serve this notice today and you were to challenge the proceeding in court, you would have a strong argument that the entire process was improperly initiated and must begin again, which would give you at minimum an additional 90 days, plus whatever processing time the court required." He paused. "It also means that if I were to return to Tucson and inform Mr. Crane that I have reviewed the loan documents and found a procedural deficiency, he would either need to correct it and begin again, or he would need to work with me to negotiate a resolution." Theodora looked at him for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" It was the right question. It was the only question. He was Crane's hired man. This was not his property, not his problem. He had been retained to serve a notice, and he was, instead, identifying legal defenses for the person the notice was directed at. He did not have a clean answer for why he was doing this. He had several answers that were professionally respectable, having to do with the proper conduct of legal procedure and the duty of an attorney not to participate in fraud. Those answers were real and were not nothing, but they were not the complete picture. The complete picture included the washing on the line and the kitchen garden in careful rows, and the jars of preserves on the shelves, and the needlework above the fireplace that said, "This ground was won, and it will not be surrendered," and the flower on her left forearm and the coffee that she had handed him without hesitation, as if the right response to a stranger at your door in the morning was to offer him something warm. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Hawkins. I am going to make more coffee. You are going to tell me what my options are." And just like that, the morning changed direction entirely, the way a river changes direction when it meets an unexpected ridge and finds a new path, not stopped, not broken, just redirected towards something it did not know was waiting. Cecil sat at the scrubbed pale table and he talked to her about law. He had not talked to someone like this in a long time, not as an equal, not in the way that required him to explain not just what the rules were, but why they existed, and what they were meant to protect. She asked precise questions. She remembered everything he said and built on it, connecting pieces in a way that told him she had a mind that was comfortable with complexity and consequence. She was not pretending to understand. She was actually understanding. By the time the second pot of coffee was done, they had a strategy. It was not a guaranteed strategy. Nothing in law is guaranteed, as Cecil noted, and as Theodora accepted with the pragmatic calm of someone who had long since learned that nothing in life was guaranteed either. But it was a legitimate legal argument, and it was the kind of argument that, presented correctly, would at minimum force Crane to start the process over and at maximum might compel the bank to negotiate a payment arrangement under the threat of having the entire proceeding challenged in territorial court. Cecil agreed to go back to Tucson and present Crane with the procedural issue before serving any formal notice. He put this in writing, a brief document stating that he had reviewed the relevant loan documentation and found that proper notice procedure had not been followed, and that he was returning to discuss the matter with Mr. Crane before taking any further action. He signed it, and she kept a copy, and having a piece of paper with his signature felt to both of them like something solid in an uncertain situation. He stood on the porch to leave, and she stood in the doorway, and the sun had moved considerably while they sat at that table, and the bruised morning sky had resolved into a clear blue afternoon, and the light was warm and honest on her face. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, "I do not know what made you decide to tell me what you found in those papers." "Professional obligation," he said, and it was true in part. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the first time, with that measuring attention that saw more than he was comfortable with. "Come back," she said, "after you have spoken with Crane. Come back and tell me what he says." "I will," he said. He rode back toward Tucson in the afternoon sun and thought about the way she had said, "Come back," and the way it had landed in him somewhere below rational thought. Everett Crane was a wide man with pale eyes and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his life had to wonder whether the rules applied to him. He sat behind his mahogany desk in the wood-paneled office on the main street of Tucson and listened to Cecil explain the procedural deficiency with the expression of someone who is listening to rain on a roof and finding it personally offensive. "The clause is there, Crane," Cecil said, and placed the copy of the loan document on the desk. "You can read it yourself. 90 days written notice before proceedings. The notification you sent 6 weeks ago does not fulfill that requirement." Crane looked at the document and then at Cecil and then at the document again. "This is a technicality," he said. "It is a contractual obligation," Cecil said. "The difference is significant." "She owes the money," Crane said. "The money is owed. That is the fact of the matter." "The money is owed," Cecil agreed. "The process by which you recover it must comply with the terms of the contract. Those terms require proper notice, and proper notice has not been given. If you proceed with the current action, Miss Ramsey has grounds to challenge the entire proceeding in territorial court, and I would suggest to you that a territorial court judge is unlikely to look kindly on a bank that did not follow its own contractual procedures when dealing with a sole female homesteader who has documented attempts to negotiate a payment arrangement." The pale eyes went slightly narrower at that. "She made 4 visits to the bank," Cecil continued. "There are no written records of those visits, no documentation of a payment plan being rejected, no documentation of anything. To a judge, that absence of documentation will look either like incompetence or like deliberate obstruction." Crane was quiet for a moment. He picked up a paperweight from his desk and set it down again. "What are you suggesting, Hawkins?" "I am suggesting," Cecil said, "that you negotiate a payment arrangement with Miss Ramsey. She has made it clear she wants to pay the debt. She has specific figures in mind. She has a functioning, productive property that can generate the income to service a reasonable payment schedule. A settlement is better for everyone than a court challenge." "And if I refuse," Crane said. "Then I am not able to serve the notice," Cecil said. "I reviewed the documents and found procedural grounds for challenge. I cannot in good conscience serve a notice I believe would be successfully challenged in court. That would expose my client, which is the bank, to unnecessary legal risk. I am acting in the bank's interest, Crane." It was a careful thing to say, because it was true in a narrow sense that was also not the whole truth. Cecil was indeed acting in the bank's interest by not exposing them to a court challenge. He was not mentioning that he was also acting in Theodora Ramsey's interest by the same action. Crane looked at him with those pale eyes for a long moment. "You have an interest in this property," he said. "I have an interest in the rule of law," Cecil said. "I am a lawyer. That is the whole of my profession." "The woman is attractive," Crane said. Cecil felt something cold move through him. "That observation is not relevant to the legal analysis," he said, and his voice came out very level. "Do you want to discuss the payment arrangement, or do you want to explain to a judge why your bank failed to follow its own contractual procedures?" In the end, Crane agreed to a meeting. Not graciously, not warmly, but he agreed, because the legal risk was real and he was smart enough to know it, and he preferred his advantages to come without court records attached to them. The meeting would be in 1 week at the bank, and Theodora Ramsey could present her payment proposal to the bank board directly. Cecil rode back to the homestead the following morning. He had told himself he would send word by the town postman, who made a circuit of the surrounding homesteads twice a week. He had told himself there was no professional necessity for him to make the ride personally. He had nonetheless been in the saddle by 7 in the morning. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, kneeling in the dirt between rows of beans, and she stood when she heard his horse and shaded her eyes against the morning light, and watched him ride up with the same unhurried attention she gave to everything. She was wearing a different dress from the day before, a faded blue one, and her hair was in the same practical bun with the same rebellious pieces coming loose around her face, and there was dirt on both her knees. He tied his horse at the gate and walked up to the fence line of the garden and told her what Crane had agreed to. He watched her face as he spoke. She was very still, listening, the same way she had been still in the kitchen listening to him talk about the law, that quality of complete attention that made a person feel that what they were saying mattered to someone. When he finished, she said, 1 week. 1 week, he confirmed. "I need to prepare the figures properly," she said. "I need them to be exact and presented so clearly that there is no room for interpretation." She paused, looking at him with those thinking eyes. "Will you help me prepare them?" He should not have been surprised that she asked. She had already demonstrated that she was not a woman who refused useful resources when they were available. "I can do that," he said. "I cannot pay you," she said. It was direct and without apology. "I know," he said, and that was also direct, and neither of them made anything more of it than it was. He came back 3 more times that week. On the second visit, they sat at the kitchen table for 5 hours going through her ledger books, which she kept with a meticulous double entry system that he recognized as more sophisticated than many of the businesses he dealt with in Tucson. The figures told a clear story, a property that was viable, that generated consistent income from the horse breeding and the garden's surplus, and the occasional work she did breaking horses for neighboring ranches. Income that had been sufficient to service the debt before 2 catastrophic winters had left her with dead cattle and a drastically reduced herd. And that was now, with the herd rebuilt, more than capable of covering a structured payment arrangement. On the third visit, they went over the presentation itself. Cecil taught her how to frame the legal and financial argument in terms a bank board would find credible and difficult to dismiss. She learned quickly and pushed back when she thought he was wrong, and twice she was right and he revised his own approach accordingly. They argued companionably about the best way to present the water rights as an asset rather than a point of contention, and the sun went down while they were arguing and neither of them noticed until the room was dim. She lit the lamp and made supper from what was in the house, a simple meal of beans and cornbread and preserved tomatoes that was better than it had any reason to be. And they ate at the same scrubbed table where they had reviewed loan documents, and they talked about other things, about the territory, about the war and what had come after, about what it meant to want to hold on to something and what it cost, and about whether the West was really what anyone had hoped it was or whether it was just another place where ordinary people were at the mercy of other ordinary people who happened to have gotten to the power first. She had strong opinions. She was not afraid to have them. She said things with the directness of someone who had long since stopped worrying about whether her opinions were welcomed, because there had been nobody around to welcome or dismiss them for 3 years, and that had freed her from caring overly much what anyone thought. He found this extraordinary. He had known women who were cautious and women who were bold, women who performed their opinions and women who hid them. But he had not spent an evening in conversation with a woman who simply said what she thought because she had thought it through, and it seemed correct to her, and that was reason enough to say it. He found himself talking more than he normally did, drawn out by her questions, giving her more of his actual thoughts rather than the measured professional responses he usually offered. And it was like being read, uncomfortably and also not uncomfortably at all. On the 4th visit, 2 days before the meeting, he arrived to find her sitting on the porch in the late afternoon with a piece of harness that needed mending laid across her lap, working at it with a leather needle, with the concentrated focus she brought to everything. He sat down in the other chair without being invited, because by this point the invitation was understood between them, and he had brought the drafted payment proposal with him in a clean copy, and he set it on the railing between them and they went through it once more. When they had finished, and the document was as good as it could be made, she set the harness aside and looked at the valley and said, "I used to think that if I worked hard enough, things would come right. That was what my father believed, and I believed it too, because I watched him work and I watched what the work produced, and it seemed like evidence." Cecil was quiet, listening. "I'm not sure I still believe that," she said. "Not in the simple way. I think working hard is necessary. I do not think it is sufficient. I think you also have to understand the systems that surround you and how those systems can be used against you. And that understanding is something nobody teaches you if you are the kind of person they expect to stay in your place." She paused. "You know things that took you years of study to learn. I did not have those years. I had a homestead and 2 dying parents and nobody who thought to tell me that there were rules about how a bank could foreclose and that I had rights I could exercise." "You know now," he said. "Because you came here," she said. "And that is a strange thing to think about. You came here to take this place from me, and instead you are helping me keep it, and that turns on nothing more than the particular person Crane happened to hire. If he had hired someone who had not read the fine print, or who had not cared about what the fine print said, I would have 30 days to pack my life into a wagon and find somewhere else to be." Cecil thought about this. It was the kind of thought that made the ground seem less stable under his feet. The idea that the entire trajectory of a person's life could turn on whether a man arriving at their door decided to look carefully at a piece of paper before doing what he had been paid to do. It made the world feel both random and fragile. "I am glad I read the fine print," he said. She looked at him then, a full look, not the measuring kind but something different, something that had less professional distance in it. And he looked back at her, and they were very still for a moment on the porch in the late afternoon light, with the mended harness between them and the valley stretching out before them and the washing moving on the line. Then she picked up the harness again and said, "I will be ready for the meeting," and the moment dissolved, though it did not entirely leave. The meeting at the Southwestern Territorial Bank was on a Thursday. Cecil had arrived in Tucson the night before and stayed at the hotel on the main street, and he had spent the evening reviewing his notes and telling himself that the outcome of this meeting was not his responsibility, that he had done what he could do and the rest was in the hands of a bank board and a woman's ability to present her case, and that either way, after this, his involvement would be finished. He had not convinced himself of this by morning. Theodora arrived at the bank at 10 o'clock in a dark green dress that he had not seen before, and that was clearly her best, though it had also been repaired at the left cuff, where the fabric had worn thin, a repair so careful that you had to look directly at it to see it. Her hair was up in a more formal arrangement than her working bun, and she had the payment proposal in a leather document folder that looked as if it had belonged to her father. She walked into the bank the way she walked everywhere, as if she had every right to be there, which she did. The bank board consisted of 3 men. The bank president, a man named Alderton who was fat and watchful and gave very little away. A director named Hicks who appeared to be primarily concerned with when the meeting would be over. And Everett Crane, who sat at the far end of the table with his pale eyes and his particular confidence, and who looked at Theodora when she sat down as if she was an inconvenience that had nonetheless not yet been resolved. Cecil sat to Theodora's left. He was not presenting the case. That was her work to do, and she knew it, and she did not look at him for reassurance when she sat down and opened the document folder and spread the papers before her. She began to speak. He had heard her speak before, had sat across from her at that kitchen table for hours listening to her think, but this was different. This was Theodora Ramsey, who had run a homestead alone for 3 years facing down 3 men who held every institutional advantage in the room. And she spoke as if the institutional advantages were irrelevant to the truth of what she was saying, which was that she owed a debt. She had always intended to pay that debt. She had been denied the opportunity to negotiate a reasonable payment structure through a documented pattern of institutional avoidance. And the foreclosure proceedings as initiated were legally defective under the terms of the original loan agreement and would not survive a court challenge. She did not raise her voice. She did not appear nervous. She laid the figures out with the clarity of someone who had gone over them until they were as familiar as her own hands. And when Alderton interrupted with a question about the livestock valuation, she answered it without consulting the paper in front of her because she knew the number and had known it before she sat down. Crane tried twice to redirect the conversation toward the arrears amount, and both times she acknowledged the arrears and returned to the payment structure, not dismissively, not in a way that could be characterized as hostile, but with the immovable patience of someone who was not going to be pulled off course. The third time he tried, Cecil quietly placed his copy of the loan agreement on the table and pointed to the relevant clause, and Alderton read it and set it down with the particular expression of a man who had just discovered a problem that was going to cause him additional work. By 11:30, the bank board had agreed to a payment arrangement. It was not exactly what Theodora had proposed. It required a slightly larger quarterly payment than she had asked for, which was predictable and which they had anticipated. But it was a legally binding arrangement, recorded in writing, with specific terms and a defined timeline, and it included language confirming that the existing foreclosure proceedings were being suspended pending the successful commencement of the payment plan. She shook Alderton's hand at the end with the composed gravity of someone receiving what was due to her rather than a favor from anyone. She shook Hicks's hand. She did not shake Crane's hand, and he did not offer it, and they simply looked at each other for a moment across the table, with the clear mutual understanding that this was not over in any deeper sense, that he had wanted the land for the water rights, and he still wanted the land for the water rights, and that she was not going to let her guard down. Cecil walked out of the bank beside her into the bright Tucson afternoon, and she stopped on the boardwalk and took a breath and let it out, and then she turned to him, and her face was fully open in a way he had not seen before, unguarded in a way she could not quite control, because she was a woman who controlled herself very well, and this had knocked the control loose for just a moment. "We did it," she said. "You did it," he said. "Do not be modest," she said. "You found the clause, you prepared me. You sat in that room and put that document on the table at exactly the right moment. You did not need the document on the table," he said. "You had them before that." She looked at him, and then she did something he had not seen her do before. She smiled, not the small private half-smile he had observed at occasional moments during the week, but a full, unrestrained smile that changed her whole face, that made her look younger and entirely incandescent, and Cecil felt it hit him somewhere in the chest with the force of a thing that had been building for a week and had finally arrived. He had, at some point during the past week, fallen thoroughly and irreversibly in love with Theodora Ramsey. He was aware of this as one is aware of a change in weather, as a thing that has already happened by the time you notice it, that did not ask permission and is not going to reverse itself because you find the timing inconvenient. He was also aware, with the sober professional part of himself that was watching this development from a slight distance, that she had just been through a significant ordeal, that her situation was still financially precarious, and that a woman who had spent 3 years alone running a homestead and had just finished fighting off an illegal foreclosure attempt was not necessarily in the market for a complication of the emotional variety introduced by the man who had shown up to evict her. "Come and have lunch," she said. "Let me buy you lunch. There is a place down the street." They had lunch, and it was the best hour Cecil had spent in Tucson in the 2 years he had lived there, sitting across a small table in the noisy, dusty Main Street cafe from a woman who was coming down from the intensity of the morning, and relaxing into something that was entirely different, more open, more curious, funnier, because she was funny in a dry, quiet way that did not announce itself, and appeared unexpectedly in conversation like water finding a crack in rock. She asked him about himself, which nobody did with particular interest, and he found himself telling her things that were true and rarely said, about why he had come west and what he had thought he would find and what he had found instead, about the practice in Tucson that was adequate but not what he had hoped it would be, about the fact that he had not been sure, for some time, whether he was building a life or simply occupying one. She listened to all of this with the same full attention she gave to everything and asked questions that were precisely the right questions, the ones that pushed the conversation deeper rather than safer. When they walked back out into the afternoon, she was headed to the livery to collect her horse for the ride back, and he walked with her, and at the livery door she turned and held out her hand. "Thank you, Cecil," she said. "I mean it." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm and her hand was rough from work, and the contact lasted a fraction of a second longer than a formal handshake required, which might have been nothing at all. "I would like to come out and check in," he said. "In a few weeks. Make sure the first payment is processed correctly and the arrangement is holding." She looked at him with that see-through look. "Is that a professional visit?" she said. "It could be both," he said. A pause, the sound of horses in the stable behind the livery doors, the noise of the street, a man calling out to someone 3 buildings down. In the middle of all of it, Theodora looked at him and he looked back at her. "Come in 3 weeks," she said. "I will have the first payment made and I will know how the summer garden finished. There will be coffee." "I will bring something," he said. "What?" she said, curious. "I do not know yet," he said. "I will think of something appropriate." She looked at him for a moment longer, and that small half-smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Then she went into the livery for her horse, and he stood on the street and watched her go and thought about appropriate things to bring a woman in 3 weeks, and also about the fact that 3 weeks was a very long time. He went back in 2.5 weeks, which was still technically 3 weeks if you did not count too carefully. He brought a book, because he had been trying to think of what she would want, and he had finally decided that a woman who ran a homestead alone for 3 years and had nobody to talk to but herself would want books, and he had found in a shop in Tucson a copy of a recent novel and a volume of essays by someone whose ideas he thought might interest her, and he had brought both, wrapped in brown paper. She looked at the wrapped parcel and then at him with raised eyebrows when he handed it to her at the porch. "A book," she said. "2 books," he said. "2 books," she repeated, and the way she said it, just slightly soft, made him think he had chosen correctly. She unwrapped them on the porch and looked at both and then at him. "Come inside," she said. "I want to tell you about the first payment." The first payment had been made and confirmed. She had been into Tucson herself to deliver it and had insisted on a written receipt, which she showed him with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had learned to leave nothing to chance. The arrangement was holding. The bank had sent no further communications outside the standard quarterly notice, and Crane had not appeared on or near the property. They spent the afternoon on the porch. She had been breaking a new horse that morning, and she told him about it with the technical precision of someone who genuinely loved the work, describing the process with an attention to the animal's particular personality and responses that he found unexpectedly moving. He told her about a contract dispute he had been working on in town, a case that was genuinely interesting legally, and she engaged with it the same way she engaged with everything, directly, and with questions he had not thought of. At some point the afternoon became evening and the light went golden and low and soft, and she brought out 2 glasses of water and they sat in the golden light and talked about smaller things, quieter things, the kind of conversation that does not need to be important to matter. "You have been back twice now," she said. It was observational rather than challenging. "I have been back once," he said. "This is the second visit." "The first was professional," she said. "This one is both," he said. She looked out at the valley the way she often did when she was considering something. "You live in Tucson," she said. "I have an office and a room above a boot shop," he said. "I would not describe it as living anywhere in particular. I am not easy to court," she said, still looking at the valley, her voice level. "I do not say that as a warning exactly. I say it as information. I have been running this place alone for 3 years, and I have my own way of doing things and my opinions about what I need and what I do not need, and I am not going to pretend otherwise because it is more convenient for someone who is interested in me." "I know," he said. "You have met me 4 times," she said. "5, he said, "counting today." She turned and looked at him then, and there was something warm in her expression that she was not hiding. "That is a fairly small sample," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I have formed a strong opinion on the available evidence." The corner of her mouth moved. "What is your opinion?" He was quiet for a moment because the honest answer deserved to be said with some care. "That you are the most capable and direct and interesting person I have met in the territory," he said. "That every time I come out here I do not want to leave. That I think about what you would say about things that have nothing to do with you, and that is generally how I know something has become important to me." She was quiet for a moment. The evening sounds of the property settled around them, the horses in the barn, the last birds before dark. "Come back again," she said. He came back every 3 weeks for the rest of the summer and into the fall. He rode the road from Tucson so many times that he knew every rut, and the horse knew the way without being directed. And each visit was different from the last because the property was alive and seasonal, and always in some new stage of labor. The harvest in late summer, and the root cellar filling in September, and the first of the fall storms in October that had her on the roof replacing a damaged section of shingles before he had even tied his horse. And he had gone up the ladder after her and helped finish the work while she told him he did not have to, and he told her to hand him the hammer. Working beside her was something he had not anticipated would be part of it, but it was. She was not a woman who sat still well, and the times he came when she had work to do, she did not stop for him but instead absorbed him into it, handing him the end of something that needed 2 people to carry, asking his opinion on where a fence post should go, teaching him with a particular straight-faced patience how to do things he had never had occasion to learn, the proper way to check a horse's hooves, how to read the color of the sky for weather, how to mend harness. He was not incompetent at any of it, which seemed to surprise her. He had grown up working, he explained, before the law books, and there were certain kinds of practical problem-solving that came back to him easily once his hands remembered the motions. In the evenings after the work they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked, and the talking was the center of it for him, that particular ease that had begun the first morning and had deepened with every visit until he felt more honest in this kitchen than anywhere else in his life. He fell further in love with her every time he came, which was not a gradual thing so much as a series of specific moments that accumulated. The particular way she held her coffee cup with both hands first thing in the morning, the sound she made under her breath when she read something she found interesting, the way she stood in the kitchen garden and looked at the rose with the same expression a person wears when looking at something they have made and finding it good, the laugh she had when something struck her as genuinely funny, rare and full, and completely unguarded. He had not yet told her that he loved her. He was not sure of the right moment, or whether there was a right moment, or whether the right approach was not to make a declaration at all, but simply to continue appearing on the road to her gate every 3 weeks, until the nature of his intentions was too obvious to require words. He suspected she already knew. She saw things clearly, and she had been watching him as carefully as he had been watching her. It was in October, on a visit when the air had gone crisp and the leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold, that she settled the question herself. They had been walking the fence line on the east boundary because she had found a section that needed attention, and she wanted his opinion on whether it needed patching or replacing. And the conversation had moved from fence posts to the second quarterly payment, which had gone smoothly, to the state of her horse herd, which was good, to a letter she had received from a relative in Tennessee who had expressed some concern about her situation and offered, with what she described as a well-intentioned but deeply misguided generosity, to send a male cousin to help manage the property. She had not answered the letter yet. "What will you tell him?" Cecil asked. "That I am managing the property," she said. "That I do not require a cousin." "Is there anything you do require?" he asked, and it came out with a directness he had not planned, but that once it was out he did not want to take back. She stopped walking. They were beside the creek, the water running quiet and clear over smooth stones, the cottonwood leaves falling one by one into the current and going gold and brilliant downstream. She looked at the water for a moment, and then she looked at him. "I have been thinking about that," she said. He waited. "I spent 3 years doing this alone," she said, "and I am good at being alone. I want to be honest about that. I did not spend 3 years pining for someone to come and help me carry things. I built a life that worked on my terms, and I was not looking to change it." She paused. "And then you came up the path with that folded notice in your pocket, and I handed you coffee and you forgot to give it to me, and I thought, there is a man who is at least more complicated than he appeared at the gate." He was very still. "I have been watching you all summer," she said. "You are patient. You are honest in a way that costs you something, because honest people in your profession do not always do as well as the other kind. You come out here and you work alongside me without acting as if that is a favor you are doing. You listen when I talk. You disagree with me when you think I am wrong, which I respect." She stopped. "I am telling you that if you are going to keep riding out here every 3 weeks, I would rather it was because we have settled what this is. I would like to court you properly," he said, and his voice was steady but his pulse was not. "I would like to come regularly and often, and with the clear purpose of convincing you that marrying me is an idea worth considering." A beat of silence. The creek, the falling leaves. "That is a very lawyerly proposal," she said. "It is not a proposal," he said. "It is a statement of intent." "Is there a difference?" she said, and the small half-smile was there, the one he had catalogued over months of visits, and that still did precisely the same thing to him every time. "A proposal comes later," he said, "when I have made a convincing case." "You are already making one," she said. It was simple and honest, and she said it without ceremony, the way she said most things. He reached out and took her hand, there by the creek in the October sun, and she let him. And they stood like that for a moment in the golden light with the leaves coming down around them, and he thought that he had never in his life wanted so badly to be somewhere specific. This place, this valley, this woman's hand in his. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and she made supper, and they ate and talked until late. And when he left, she stood at the fence gate and watched him go, and he turned back once to look at her standing in the lamplight that came through the windows, and thought that there was not a more specific and precise picture of what he wanted his life to look like. He came back the following week instead of 3 weeks later, and she was not surprised. He came back the week after that as well. November came in with cold and the first hint of snow on the mountains to the north, and he began to stay for 2 days rather than one, sleeping in the barn on the first visit and then, by some unspoken agreement, in the spare room that had been her father's study, a small room with a window that faced east and a narrow bed and shelves that still held her father's few books. He was spending more time at the homestead than in Tucson, and the practice in Tucson was suffering for it, which ought to have worried him more than it did. What it actually did was clarify something he had been unclear about for 2 years, which was what he wanted his life to look like and where he wanted to be. He had a conversation with Theodora about this in December, sitting by the kitchen fire on a cold evening after she had spent the day working with the horses, and he had spent the afternoon reviewing a contract for a neighboring rancher who had come to him at the homestead, because someone in town had mentioned that the lawyer from Tucson was often out at the Ramsey place, and they had practical legal questions. It had been the third such visit, the third time someone from the surrounding area had sought him out at the homestead for legal work. "There is enough work in this valley for a lawyer," she said, looking at the fire. "More than enough. Most of these people have nobody to go to unless they ride all the way to Tucson." "I know," he said. "You have been thinking about it," she said. "I have been thinking about several things that are somewhat connected," he said. She looked at him. The fire moved. The winter outside pressed against the walls and made the inside feel warmer by contrast. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have been building a case for 4 months, and I believe the argument is sound, and I would rather make it now than make you wait any longer." He paused. "I want to marry you, and I want to be here. Not in Tucson with an office above a boot shop. Here, in this valley, doing work that matters to people, and being part of this place that you have built and held and refused to surrender." She looked at him for a long time. Not the measuring kind of look, or the considering kind, but the kind that she gave to things she had already made up her mind about and was simply allowing herself the moment of acknowledging. "You would give up the practice in Tucson," she said. "I would build one here," he said, slowly. "It would not be the same and it would not make us wealthy, but you have shown me that wealth is not the point. You understand," she said, "that there will be difficult years. There will be bad winters again. There always are. The debt is manageable now, but it requires watching, and the arrangement with the bank requires vigilance, and Crane has not given up on this land, I know that, and there will be things to face that I cannot predict." "I know," he said. "And you still want this," she said. "More than anything I have ever known," he said. She was quiet for one more moment, one long, full moment by the fire, and then she said, "Yes." "The answer is yes." He went around the table to her, and she stood to meet him, and he kissed her there in the firelight, her cold hands against his face, and the smell of winter and horses and coffee and everything that was her. And it was exactly right. The way things are exactly right when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. They were married in March of 1880, in the early spring when the valley was beginning to come green again, and the creek was running full from the snowmelt in the mountains. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through the valley every 6 weeks, a lean, serious man named Brody, who had married half the couples within 50 miles, and seemed genuinely pleased to do it again. There were perhaps 20 people present, neighbors from the surrounding homesteads who had been watching the lawyer from Tucson ride out to the Ramsey place with increasing frequency, and who had drawn their own conclusions with the particular accuracy of people who have little else in the way of entertainment. Theodora wore the dark green dress from the bank meeting, because it was her best, and she refused to see any reason to acquire a new one for the purpose. And she had put flowers in her hair that she had picked from the early spring growth along the creek, small pale things that she wore in a loose arrangement that was not quite formal and not quite casual, and was entirely her. Cecil wore his good coat, the one without the ink stain on the left cuff, and he stood at the fence post where he had tied his horse the very first morning, and watched her come across the yard toward him with the morning sun behind her, and thought that nothing in the law books he had read for 2 years instant. Louis had prepared him for this, for this particular moment of knowing exactly what mattered and exactly where he was. They exchanged vows that were simple and direct, which suited both of them. The preacher spoke briefly about the nature of partnership and the preacher's version of what made a marriage solid, which was roughly aligned with what Cecil privately believed, namely that it required honesty and the willingness to actually look at each other rather than simply sharing a space. Afterward there was food, a genuine spread, because the neighbors had brought things and Theodora had been cooking for 2 days, and there was a small celebration around the big kitchen table and on the porch and spilling into the yard, the kind of celebration that happens in places where celebrations are infrequent and therefore fully inhabited when they occur. He sold the practice in Tucson by April, the small, tidy process of transferring his client files and giving up the room above the boot shop and loading what he owned into a wagon that he drove out to the valley in a single trip, arriving at the homestead on a Tuesday morning with everything he had, which was not an overwhelming quantity of things, but which included his law books and the box of papers he had accumulated over 2 years of practice and his father's watch, which he had carried since the war. She came out onto the porch when she heard the wagon and looked at it and at him and at the load in the wagon bed. "Is that everything?" she said. "That is everything," he said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something was settled. "Good," she said. "Come in. Coffee is on." The spring and summer of 1880 were the kind of days that are later remembered as having been gold all the way through, which they were not, because there was work and difficulty and the ordinary frictions of 2 strong-willed people sharing a life. But the gold was real even when it was not the whole of the weather. Cecil set up a legal practice from the homestead, with a room in the house that he converted to a study, and where neighbors came with their deeds and their disputes and their questions. And within 4 months he was busier than he had been in Tucson, and the work was better, more connected to actual people and actual land and actual consequences. Theodora continued the horse breeding and the garden and the careful management of the cattle herd, and she and Cecil managed the finances together, his legal understanding and her deep knowledge of the property combining into something more capable than either had been separately. They made the quarterly payments to the bank on schedule, every one of them, with Theodora's careful ledger and Cecil's equally careful written records of every transaction with the bank, because neither of them had forgotten what Crane was capable of, and both of them intended to make sure there was never a document out of place that could be used against them. Crane made one more move in August of 1880. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would miss if you were not paying attention. A question raised through the bank's solicitor about the legal standing of the water rights under the current payment arrangement. A challenge framed as a routine clarification, but clearly intended to create an opening. Cecil identified it within a day of receiving the correspondence, wrote a meticulous legal response citing 4 separate precedents and the original water rights filing, and had it delivered to the bank's solicitor in Tucson before the end of the week. He received a brief acknowledgement and nothing further. The challenge was dropped. Crane was not finished, he suspected, but Crane had learned that the homestead was no longer a matter of an isolated woman without legal representation, and the calculation had changed. In September, Theodora told him she was going to have a child. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning, with the same directness she brought to everything. She had suspected for 3 weeks and had waited to be certain, and now she was certain. And she told him and then waited to see what he did with it, because that was how she operated. She gave you information and then watched what you did. He looked at her across the table, the familiar pale wood with the flower ghost marks that never quite scrubbed out, with the coffee cups between them and the morning light coming through the window, and he felt something move in him that was larger than any feeling he had a word for. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he needed to know. "I am very well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hands in both of his, because the moment required something and words were not the right medium for all of it. She let him hold her hands and looked at him with warm, steady eyes. "This is good," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Their son was born in April of 1881, on a night when the spring storms came in hard from the north, and the wind howled around the house, and the creek ran high. And the birth was attended by a neighbor woman named Martha Hollies, who had 6 children of her own, and moved through the process with the calm competence of long experience. Cecil was not permitted in the room, which was the custom, and he sat in the kitchen and listened to the sounds from the bedroom and was more frightened than he had been in the war, which he would not have predicted. When Martha Hollies opened the door and looked at him and said, "A son, a healthy boy. Your wife is well." He sat very still for a moment, and then he put his face in his hands, not in grief but in the profound physical release of a fear dissolved. Theodora was sitting up in the bed when they let him in, tired in a way that was completely different from any tiredness he had seen in her, a deep and bedrock tiredness, and she had the child in her arms, and she looked at him when he came in and said, "Come and meet your son." He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small new person in her arms, red-faced and ferociously alive, with a scrunch of dark hair and shut-tight eyes that were already somehow entirely his own. "He is remarkable," Cecil said, which was not the most original thing anyone had said about a newborn, but which he meant completely. "He is," Theodora said, and looked down at the child with an expression that Cecil had never seen on her face before, and that was not like any of the other expressions he had catalogued over the years of knowing her. It was utterly unguarded and completely full. They named the boy Samuel for her father. It had been her suggestion, and he had agreed without hesitation, because it was right, and because the needlework above the fireplace said, "This ground was won, and it will not be surrendered." And Samuel Ramsey had won it first, and his grandson should carry the name forward. Samuel Cecil Hawkins grew into the first year of his life with the particular vitality of a child, who is both loved and in the way, always underfoot, always reaching for things, pulling himself to standing at the kitchen table at 8 months, and regarding the coffee cups with an alarming entrepreneurial interest. He had his mother's eyes, that warm brown color, and his father's way of concentrating entirely on whatever had his attention, which was everything and sequentially. The homestead expanded in that year. The horse breeding business had grown to the point where they needed additional hands, and Cecil hired a young man from a nearby homestead named Eli, who was good with horses and needed the work, and a woman named Rosa who came with her family when they settled 3 miles to the north, and who worked in the garden in exchange for a share of the produce. And suddenly, the place that had been one woman's solitary labor was a small working community that felt, in its best moments, like what Cecil thought a frontier outpost was supposed to be. He continued the legal practice, and it continued to grow. He had taken on work for several of the surrounding ranchers, helped negotiate a water dispute between 2 families who would otherwise have escalated to something ugly, written wills for 3 men who had never had one, and successfully argued a property boundary case before the territorial judge that had established a precedent the territorial newspapers wrote about in 2 lines, which was the most publicity Cecil had ever received, and which Theodora had read aloud at breakfast with a dry satisfaction that he appreciated. In the spring of 1882, a letter arrived from the Southwestern Territorial Bank. Cecil read it twice before showing it to Theodora, standing at the kitchen table while Samuel sat on the floor attempting to eat the rag rug and being periodically redirected. The letter was from the bank's board of directors, not from Crane. It informed them that Everett Crane had resigned from his position as land agent effective March of 1882, following an investigation by the territorial government into his practices regarding property acquisition. The investigation had found, among other things, that Crane had engaged in a pattern of deliberately obstructing homesteaders' attempts to negotiate payment arrangements, then initiating foreclosure to acquire properties below market value. Several families had already had their properties restored or received compensation. The letter was not an apology exactly, but it was a formal acknowledgement that the proceedings against the Ramsey property had been part of this pattern, and that the bank wished to formalize the good standing of the current payment arrangement and provide a clear timeline to full resolution of the debt. Cecil set the letter down on the table and looked at Theodora. She read it once, steadily, without expression. Then she set it down and she looked at the window and at the yard beyond it, at the kitchen garden where the first spring green was just beginning to show in the rows that Rosa had planted 2 weeks ago, and at the barn where she could hear Eli talking to the horses in the easy way he had with them. "Good," she said. She picked up Samuel from the floor, redirecting him from the rug to a wooden block, and looked at Cecil over the child's head. "How long until the debt is paid?" He did the calculation. 14 months, he said. "At the current payment rate." She nodded. "I want a party when the last payment is made," she said. "I want to invite everyone in the valley." "Then we will have one," he said. The 14 months passed with the ordinary velocity of time when it is fully inhabited. Theodora had another child, a girl they named Clara, in the winter of 1883, and where Samuel had been urgent and loud and in constant motion, Clara came into the world with a serenity that Theodora said was suspicious, and Cecil said he was choosing to accept gratefully. Clara looked like her father around the eyes and like her mother in the set of her jaw, which Theodora said meant she was going to be excessively reasonable and stubborn in equal measure, and Cecil said those qualities did not seem to him like problems. The final payment to the Southwestern Territorial Bank was made on a Thursday in March of 1884. Cecil rode into Tucson himself to make it, and to receive the formal receipt and the discharge of the lien, which was a document he folded very carefully and put in the breast pocket of his coat for the ride back. The same pocket where, 5 years before, he had carried an eviction notice that he had never delivered. He thought about that on the road home, the particular path a life had taken, the pivot point of a single morning, a single door opened, a cup of coffee handed to a stranger. He thought about what Theodora had said once, in a quiet moment, that the course of things turned on particular people making particular choices, and that the choices were not always large ones. Sometimes it was simply a choice to look carefully at a piece of paper before doing what you had been paid to do. Sometimes it was a choice to hand coffee to a stranger and see what kind of person they turned out to be. He came through the gate in the late afternoon, and she was on the porch with Clara in her lap and Samuel racing around the yard in some elaborate game involving a stick and the specific corner of the fence post. And she looked up when she heard the horse and watched him come up the path. He took the discharge document out of his breast pocket and held it up. She looked at it, and then at him, and her face did the thing it sometimes did when she was feeling something larger than usual, a slight shift, a particular steadiness that was different from her everyday steadiness, that came from somewhere deeper. He came up the steps and handed her the paper, and she read it with Clara still in her lap and Samuel momentarily abandoning the game to look at the paper because it was being looked at, and that made it interesting. She read it all the way to the bottom. She looked at the date. She looked at the signature of the bank president. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. He sat in the other chair, and she set the paper on the railing, and she put Clara down to toddle after her brother in the yard, and they sat on the porch in the March afternoon, and looked at the valley and the garden and the barn and the washing on the line, the same posts, though the washing was different now, larger in number and smaller in some of the items. And the kitchen garden was larger, and the barn had been extended, and there were horses in the paddock that were the third generation of the breeding line that Theodora's father had started. "I want to ask you something," Cecil said. "Ask," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out at the yard where Samuel was explaining something to Clara with the serious authority of an older sibling, and Clara was listening with the focused doubtfulness of someone hearing an argument they plan to challenge as soon as they have better words. "I am very happy," she said. "I have been happy for some time." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it that October day by the creek 5 years before, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and they sat on the porch together in the afternoon light with the deck gone, and the land solid beneath them and the children in the yard and the coffee on the stove inside, and the whole of the valley spread before them, green and gold and entirely their own. They had their party in the spring, as she had said they would. Every family in the valley came, and some from farther, and there was food for 3 days running and music from 2 men who played fiddle, and the yard was full of people and noise and children, and the particular joy that comes from celebrating something that was nearly lost and wasn't, that was taken away and wasn't, that survived because 2 people chose, in 2 consecutive mornings, to look at what was actually in front of them. Martha Hollies, who had delivered both children, told the story of how Cecil had come to deliver the eviction notice and been given coffee, and had entirely forgotten his purpose, because by then it had become the kind of story that a community tells about itself, the story of something that ought to have gone one way and went another, and it was told with laughter, and with the warmth of people who understand that life contains these reversals. These moments when the thing that seems like the ending turns out to be the beginning. Cecil, standing with Theodora by the fence where he had first tied his horse that bruised sky morning in 1879, listening to Martha tell the story with her particular flair for the moment when Theodora handed him the coffee cup and the expression on his face, looked at his wife, and she looked at him, and they were both smiling, the 2 of them, in the way of people sharing a joke that belongs entirely to them. "You did know I was there to evict you," he said, not for the first time. "I knew before you got to the gate," she said, "and you gave me coffee anyway," he said. "I had the spring," she said. "I had year-round water and good land and a house my father built. I was not about to be inhospitable to a man who was about to have a very bad morning. I was the one delivering the eviction notice," he said. "Yes," she said, "but you were also going to have to sit on my porch and look me in the eye and give me that piece of paper, and I thought that at least one of us should be comfortable." He laughed, which was the thing she could still do to him reliably and without effort, and she watched him laugh with that warm, direct, entirely satisfied expression. And then the music started up again from the yard, and Samuel appeared around the side of the house at full sprint demanding his father's attention for something of immediate importance, and Cecil let go of her hand to deal with the emergency. And she watched them go and then looked back at the valley and the house and the garden and the horses in the paddock, and she put her hands around the coffee cup she was holding, both of them, the same way she had held a cup the first morning of the first visit on the first ordinary day. That had turned out to be the beginning of everything. The debt was paid. The land was theirs, in the fullest and most legal and most real sense of the word, with the deed in the cedar chest under the stairs and the water rights filing next to it, and the stack of quarterly payment receipts that she had kept every one of because she was a woman who had learned to keep records, and because she would never again be in a position of having no documentation of what was hers. The valley was green in the spring, and the creek ran clear, and the horses moved in the paddock with the particular ease of animals that are well kept and well tended, and the house stood solid and weather-faced with the porch that wrapped around the south side, and the window boxes that now had flowers in them, actual flowers, the kind she had wanted since she was a girl, and had not had time to cultivate when she was running the place alone. Cecil came back across the yard toward her, carrying Samuel on his shoulders and holding Clara by the hand, and he was talking to both children at once in the way he had learned to do, the particular art of 2-channel conversation that parenting demanded and that he had developed, to his own surprise, with some facility. He looked up and saw her watching, and the look he gave her across the yard, was the same look he had given her by the creek in the October cottonwood gold, the one that said she was the specific and irreplaceable center of everything that mattered to him. She raised her coffee cup to him, and he raised a hand in return. This man who had ridden up her path one bruised sky morning, with an eviction notice in his breast pocket and a practice speech that she had undone in 20 seconds flat by handing him something warm and looking at him like a person rather than a problem. The fiddle music carried over the noise of the party and out into the valley where it probably reached the creek and the cottonwoods and the dry land on the far side of the ridge, where Crane had once wanted her water. She had heard that Crane had left the territory entirely after the investigation, had gone east somewhere, had not been heard from again in this part of Arizona, and she did not think about him often, only occasionally, as a point of reference for the way things could go and had not gone, a door that had been closed at exactly the right moment by exactly the right combination of circumstance and choice. She set down the coffee cup on the porch railing and went out to join her family in the yard, walking through the gate that had been the beginning of it, into the light of the late afternoon that was warm and clean and entirely present. And the party went on around them all with the generosity of people celebrating not just a debt paid, but a life that had been built against the kind of odds that were not supposed to yield, that had yielded anyway. That stood solid and full and sunlit in the spring of 1884 in an Arizona valley, where the spring ran year-round, and the water rights were documented and filed, and the children were loud and alive, and the man she loved was putting Samuel down in the grass and watching him go and then turning to her with that particular look, and she went to him, and he put his arm around her shoulders and they stood together watching the party and the children and the valley. And it was everything, entirely, completely, without remainder. The last light of the evening came in long and golden across the porch and through the kitchen window and lit the inside of the house with the particular warmth that the end of a good day has, when everything has been done that needed to be done, and the people you love are near, and the coffee is still warm on the stove, and there is nothing left to prove to anyone. Theodora Ramsey, who was now Theodora Hawkins, though she kept both names in the usage of daily life, because both names were hers and both belonged to this land, stood in the kitchen doorway looking out at the porch and the yard, and felt the deep, quiet contentment of someone who has fought for something and won it, and gets to live in it every day. Cecil came up the porch steps as the last guests were leaving, the children having been put to bed by Rosa an hour ago with the particular efficiency of a woman who had children of her own and knew how to manage the process, and he came and stood beside her in the doorway and looked at the valley in the evening light. "Good party," he said. "Very good," she said. "Are you tired?" he said. "Not yet," she said. So they stood there together in the doorway until the light was gone, and the stars came out over the Arizona territory in the particular extravagance they had over a clear sky in the spring, so many and so bright that they seemed to have an opinion about the darkness, and the creek made its sound in the distance, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the house was full of the sleeping warmth of children and the smell of the party that had been and the coffee that was always on the stove. And there was nothing more to want and nothing left undone, and no part of the story that had not found its proper ending. Cecil put his arm around her in the doorway, and she leaned into him slightly, just slightly, in the way of two people who have been beside each other long enough, that the contact is not gesture, but simply posture, simply how they stand when they are standing together, and the stars moved overhead in their long arcs, and the valley held them and the land held them, and the whole of what they had made together was real and present and theirs, won and paid for and not surrendered, exactly as it had always been supposed to be.